Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, the 7th webinar in the Sephardi Mizrahi Jewish Speaker Series. We welcome the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation as one of our newest sponsors. So now we have 9 organizations supporting this series. We thank all of our sponsors, and they are Congregation BINA, a community of Jews from India, Canadian Institute of Jewish Research, CIJR, Bet Ra'in Synagogue, Lodzer Center Congregation, Kulanu Canada, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, CILR, Jews Against Anti-Semitism Canada, the United Grassroots Movement, and the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, CAEF. Alan Herman of CIJR and I worked together on securing speakers and making all the arrangements for these presentations. But we could not possibly do this on our own. So we would like to acknowledge and thank Rajivan Veerasingham and Fleur Sampson of Congregation BINA for their invaluable technical assistance in getting this webinar to you all today. Thanks also to Ariella Daniels for designing the flyer for us. And a special thank you to Shai Abraham for putting us in touch with Janice Benatar. Because when I met Janice, or knew Janice briefly years ago, I just assumed she was an Ashkenazi Jew. And had nothing to do with the Sephardic community. This evening's presentation is being recorded and will be available to all who registered, and it will be sent out to everyone in a few days. Please check your junk mail or spam folder, as this email will come to you from Congregation BINA. Please make sure you enter your questions in the chat, and following the presentation, we will proceed with the Q&A session. Due to possible connectivity issues for me, all the way from San Diego, Alan Herman from CIJR, who is my partner, will take over from me if it becomes necessary. Thank you, Alan. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Janice Benatar, who will be our speaker this evening, and her topic is Growing Up Jewish and Sephardic in Zimbabwe. Janice was born in Harare, Zimbabwe, at a time when the country was known as Rhodesia. These were extraordinarily tumultuous times that would ultimately see the demise of colonial white dominance in the country. Like many whites and almost the entire Jewish community, she immigrated from Zimbabwe. As a child, life for her was idyllic, with a stable home, activities including ballet, piano, drama, tennis lessons, and frequent vacations in Southern Africa. In 1983, amidst the political and social turmoil of apartheid, she went to the University of Cape Town to study ballet. In university residence, she joined the South African Union of Jewish Students and participated in risky anti-apartheid activism. Subsequently, she made Aliyah, and after doing a kibbutz ulpan, she joined the IDF and lived in Tel Aviv for the next 4 years. Her brother Michael moved to Melbourne, Australia, and was later joined by his mother, Vivian. Janice, though, decided to immigrate to Canada in 1991 and began her new career working in the Jewish community, first at State of Israel Barnes, and now at UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. Having immersed herself in several very different cultures, She has experienced the diversity of human life from its most impoverished to its most abundantly wealthy. This unique perspective and her passion for building bridges between people inspired Janice to seek a career in fundraising. This allows her to engage philanthropists with a focus on tangible positive change grounded in the values of Tikkun Olam. Janice has worked at UJA for over 20 years and is currently Vice President of Philanthropy. She is married to Elan Levitan and has 2 children, Sam and Rachel. We are thrilled to have you, Janice, as our guest speaker today. And I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much. That was, you covered my story, so I will do my best now to share some personal stories. And I really appreciate that warm introduction. I'm going to share my screen so that I can describe some of my journey and my life growing up in Zimbabwe. My presentation today will be a personal story. It's a reflection of my own personal growing up experience as a Sephardic Jew in Rhodesia and later on in Zimbabwe. I will weave in some historical facts, but given that I'm not a historian, I'm going to focus on how it was like as a young Sephardic Jewish family in Southern Africa. Southern Rhodesia became Rhodesia 5 days after I was born in its capital, which was Salisbury, and would later be renamed Harare. When I was born in 1965, Rhodesia declared independence from the British. I remember it. I don't remember that day, but I remember all the years after that, immediately after the Declaration of Independence, it was called UDI. For the next 15 years, sanctions was imposed upon Rhodesia. And in one of the most significant days in the country's history, after a very bloody civil war, 15 years after the Declaration of Independence, Robert Mugabe became the first Black president of Zimbabwe, and life for everyone changed. Reflecting back now and having lived away from Zimbabwe for so many years, I really do see clearly that the lifestyle we led was built on some actually quite awful historical injustices. But while I was living it, I can honestly say that I had the most wonderful childhood. It was without a doubt, as Anne mentioned in her intro of me, it was a privileged life. I grew up in an upscale white suburb of Salisbury. I went to Jewish day school, synagogue every Friday night. My brother and I had everything we wanted. We lived in big houses. We had a maid, a cook, a gardener. I attended ballet lessons, speech, drama, tennis. I kept my mother busy, driving me back and forth to all different kinds of things. And if I look back on it now, I feel like I had a princess upbringing. However, none of that lifestyle was due to my Sephardic Jewish upbringing. It was rather consistent with the way all whites lived. And essentially, it was colonial Africa. We weren't just a white minority within a dominant Black indigenous population. We were actually a tiny minority within a small minority. And although I have the luxury of recalling my early childhood innocently, I soon became to know that it was very, very different. We were actually strangers in a strange land. So if anything I say comes across a little politically incorrect or naive, I hope you'll understand that I'm recalling it as a young girl. It all seemed so normal to me. I didn't even think there was another lifestyle outside our home and our lifestyle, and until I went to South Africa, and I went to university in Cape Town and on to live in Israel, and then in Toronto, now in Canada. And it's only now that I see that it was actually kind of odd lifestyle. And it's only now that my own social consciousness has become part of my life. I am truly grateful for my family that brought us up to have strong values, particularly Jewish values. And not unlike other Jewish communities around the world, we knew that if we didn't build our own institutions, our community in Zimbabwe, Harare, and look out for each other, no one else would. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I just want to address this beautiful picture here, which these trees are jacaranda trees. If any of you have been to Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, it comes once a year. The trees are magnificent. They make a huge mess on the road, slip and slide, but they truly are magnificent. So today's presentation will be my own personal story, a brief history of Zimbabwe Jewish community, and I will get into some traditions and culture. Here's a little about Rhodesian Jews. The very first known Jew arrives in Rhodesia in 1868. Immigration was driven by the pogroms in Eastern Europe, and the first Jews that arrived were Ashkenazi. The first synagogue service in Salisbury was in 1895. And just to give you a sense of the historical context of that time, that was 2 years before Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland. By 1918, Salisbury's Orthodox synagogue was built, and for members of the community, it was the first time that you could buy kosher meat. And that was 1 year after the Balfour Declaration. By 1920, the Jewish population was 1,300. These gradual institutions of Jewish life were happening at a time when the massively growing consciousness in the Jewish world, when Jews everywhere were daring to hope that there might be a Jewish homeland. And for the Jewish people, this was something achievable. So at this time, when the Jewish population was 1,300, it was in the early 20s when my father and his family arrived in Rhodesia. By the 1930s, Jewish immigration was on the rise from Europe. Many Rhodes Island Jews, they called Rhodesians, immigrated to Rhodesia. Some people ask if there's any linguistic relationship between Rhodes Island and Rhodesia, and in fact, there isn't. It's just a historical coincidence. 1950s and 60s, it was a wonderful period of prosperity for the Jewish community. Youth movements were established, Jewish day schools were built, Witso, Kazo, that's the Central African Zionist Organization, Habonim, Beitar, Bnei Akiva youth movements, and 2 Jewish primary schools. For such a small community, this gave us access to organized Jewish life. And in other words, a sense of community that extended outside of our homes. 1965, after UDI, as most of you know, long before apartheid South Africa and Free Mandela became the rallying cry for freedom for Africa, a real insult and a label for people would be to be called a white Rhodesian. About 10 years after UDI, civil war broke out in Rhodesia. Again, as I grew up and became more aware of how this was portrayed on the world stage, I was so keenly aware that I actually didn't identify as a white Rhodesian. I didn't realize it at the time, but I do now. And I, as many of my friends, identified as Jews. So I can tell you that as Jews in the community at that time, this war was not our war. To give you an idea of this, while civil war raged in Rhodesia in the 1970s, conscription became a new fear. My parents were not alone in the Jewish community in doing whatever was necessary to make sure that our brothers and sons did not die in a war that we just didn't believe in. I can tell you, in our family, my brother Michael also was called up and was waiting to be called up. And he also left Rhodesia. I was quite young at the time, but I remember him packing his bags, and we were really nervous that he might not be able to come back. He went off and lived with my grandmother in South Africa under the pretense that he was going on vacation. In the inset of this photo, I added a picture of Ian Smith and his wife. They're relaxing by the pool. while the rural war raged on. It's interesting, although not to get political in this conversation, how similar the language of extremism and fascism remains over time. We grew up hearing Ian Smith say, "Never in a million years." That was his way of saying that there would never be Black rule and there would never be a one man, one vote. And the generation prior to the Second World War in Germany would have heard the Reich, who would have said that the Reich would have lasted for 1,000 years. So here's the population in 1960, 7,000 Jews, 250,000 whites, 4.5 million Blacks. So when I said that we're a minority in a small minority, I really meant just that. And I made this slide, the slide to illustrate the mathematical proportions because it really was accurate. At its height, 7,000 Jews in Rhodesia, and we really basically knew all each other in both main cities where they lived. Seeing it this way just has such an accentuation of the injustice and the oppression of colonial Africa. And of course, never in a million years was a bravado and such a shame that people had to die in a war that was inevitable. It was an inevitable country that would end up in Black rule. I picked this slide and this picture because of the year of the committee meeting. The year is 1980, when Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. And there was chaos in the country. Although there was some optimism because the civil war had ended to an extent, but people were leaving, people were afraid. However, the ladies of the Sephardic society, they continued to meet and continued with Wheatso lunches and JNF events. This is really also one of those stories that is not inconsistent with the Jewish diaspora over the centuries. Our communities just found a way to have the continuity of Jewish life persevere, no matter what the adversity was at that time. So, as a child, like all children, we knew nothing about the larger issues. When this photo was taken, I was in a Jewish nursery school. And the little pudge on the right is me. I think it was Purim, and I think I was supposed to be dressing up as Queen Esther. I went on to Sharon School, the Jewish primary school in Harare. You can see here proudly in the front of the building, you can see this big Star of David right out for everyone to see. So as a Jew, I didn't feel fearful at all. In fact, it didn't even come into my consciousness. There may have been one or two small instances that I don't even remember now, but to what I do recall, there was no apparent anti-Semitism. And as I said earlier, we knew we were a small minority within a minority and that we were distinct from the rest of the white population, but that didn't really translate into overt anti-Semitism as we understand it. Back to my days at Sharon School, we had annual concerts. This picture is this is me here on the left, and this is my standard 5, the last year of our school years. We had quizzes, we had concerts. Actually, one year, my father was in the school quiz. I remember him coming home every Tuesday evening. He would practice with the other parents from the school, and we won that year. And we really put Sharon School on the map with all the other schools in Harare. Many happy memories from my Jewish day schools, celebrating all the holidays, dressing up for Purim, preparing for our bar bat mitzvahs. Essentially, the full spectrum of Jewish simchas marking the holidays was integrated in our lives. So here's a quick aside. Years later, when I made Aliyah in 1986, and I lived there afterwards, but I joined the army, and part of my training in a Marva unit, a basic training of the IDF, all of us new recruits were expected to know and understand basic Hebrew. And to this day, I credit my days in Sharon School having saved me many hours of kitchen duty that would have incurred by not knowing the commands and instructions. I remember in those first weeks, I didn't know many of the words that were slewn at me, but I knew one word. it was onesh, which means punishment. And I remember getting an instruction from our sergeant, not understanding a word of it, and having to stand with my M16 in front of me for hours. And I learned Hebrew like a flash after that. Outside of our home, the main hub of Jewish life was synagogue life. We went all the time, every weekend, all the chagim. This picture is the Sephardic shul and celebration hall. There actually was quite a divide between the two communities and shuls. We got along, but the Sephardic and the Ashkenazis, there was some friendly rivalry. Most of the Ashkenazi Jews came from Lithuania, obviously Eastern Europe, and were quite a bit larger in numbers. We did many things together as a community, but our foods and our customs and our traditions had some distinct differences. Actually, this picture is my bat mitzvah, and the shul, the beautiful shul that you see here, is the Ashkenazi shul. We had a group bat mitzvah from the Sharon School, and so there were 5 of us, some of us were 6 of us, some of us were Ashkenazi, some of us were Sephardic, and this was the grand opening of the Ashkenazi shul. It was a beautiful synagogue. We had a typical traditional bat mitzvah with lessons to learn kashrut, Jewish homemaking. Many bat mitzvahs were done as groups in Harare. And this was my class from Sharon School. Actually, I do remember following my bat mitzvah. I felt so Jewish, I wanted our house to be kosher. And it happened to be at a time when no kosher food was available. The kosher butcher had closed down. So I made my mother kosher all the meat. We put it on slanted boards, we salted it, and it didn't really last very long, but it was an indication of how significant my bat mitzvah was. You'll see some images from the youth movements here. This was Habonim in the 1950s. For some reason, and I'm not really sure why, the Sephardics joined Beitar and the Ashkenazis joined Habonim. But there was also Bnei Akiva for the more Orthodox. I went to Beitar camp 1 year in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, with thousands of other young people from all over Southern Africa. I can't say I loved it, but it was a real experience. This is the Beitar in the 1970s, which is exactly when I was in Beitar. I'm not in this picture, but it was exactly the time I was there. My brother's bar mitzvah. It was a typical Sephardic event. We're standing in front of the Sephardic shul and the celebration hall. And although we didn't feel ourselves to be Orthodox at the time, it certainly seemed that we were, because when I came to Toronto, I realized that we sat separate seating in Harare. In Salisbury, all the synagogues both synagogues were indeed Orthodox. And I was introduced to a much wider spectrum of the larger Jewish community when I came to North America. My dad was a proud lifelong member of the Sephardic choir, and this was one of their celebrations. This is my father in the middle here, and this was just before one of the celebrations, and I remember how much he loved singing with this choir. So the Sephardic Jews, who are the Los Nuestros? This is the name given to the Sephardic Jews from Turkey and Rhodes Island. And as you can see here, they made their way over time to many different parts of the world. Those straight lines, though, that you see from Rhodes that go down to Southern Africa, in the case of my own family, was not a particularly straight line. Following the migration of Jews after this expulsion from Spain, my father's family traveled across the seas and settled in Rhodes Island, which was Italy in those days. They lived there for hundreds of years, developing their own traditions and customs. My grandparents, my father's parents, were spice makers, and on one of their travels to Egypt, my dad was born in Suez. The older siblings were still in Rhodes Island. They, for some reason, and it's bit of a mystery to us. The specific reasons why, we're still not sure, but the family all traveled and met in Southern Africa in the 1920s, and they settled there. They came with almost nothing and were amongst the first Jewish Sephardic families to arrive there. And although my father's family were Rhodesians, he in fact had never been there himself. So from Egypt, he came directly down to Southern Africa. My mom's family were from Turkey and also Egypt. My grandmother, one of 13 siblings, was born in Istanbul and my grandfather was from Alexandria in Egypt. They met as an arranged marriage in Southern Africa, and I have no idea how they ended up meeting in Southern Africa, but they made their lives in Mozambique, where my mother, her twin sister, and their brother was born. So clearly, my family came from all over the world. We were total Heinz 57. Years later, when I was living in Israel, in my very first week, I was in a hostel for new immigrants in Tel Aviv, and I was in an elevator with some Black men and women, and we introduced ourselves. And when we asked each other where we came from, I said, I'm from Zimbabwe. And they looked at me and they said, and you're white and you're Jewish? And I looked at them and said, and you're Black and you're Jewish? And we laughed. And I just didn't know about all this, the Jews from all over the world in those days. These are my grandparents. I sadly have this is on my mom's side. I have no pictures of my grandparents on my father's side. They died when he was very young in Rhodesia, and his older siblings brought him up. This is a picture this is my father's older sibling, Bully, who's standing next to a street sign that was named after the family. I don't know what we did to deserve it, but it was a proud moment for her, I'm sure. I'm going to talk here about my father's business. It was called Savonet's Products, and it was such a big part of my childhood. It was his pride and joy, and he just loved his work. The name came from roasting peanuts, savory nuts. One of his older sisters, Regina, had taught him how to roast nuts when he was a young boy. She used to roast peanuts over an open flame in Rhodes Island. And when she came to Rhodesia, she made a few dollars by selling her roasted peanuts and other Rhodesia delicacies. So my father began his business as a little kiosk roasting peanuts. It grew into a very large enterprise, selling groceries and food for farm workers. Actually, a great many Rhodesian Jews, both Sephardic and Ashkenazis, went into the grocery and retail business. The farmers loved coming to my dad's store, and he loved everything about his business. Very often, and I remember him telling us this frequently, they could be heard saying, I'm coming in to hear a joke and have a Coke, not to buy anything today. My dad had a wonderful sense of humor, and he had a terrific relationship with those who shopped at his store. My mom worked there for a little while too. In this picture, she's standing right in the middle. And the main products that they sold there were dried fish and dried worms. Farm workers did not have fridges, and my dad used to have the fish and worms dried so that they could eat them without needing refrigeration. Earlier on, I mentioned that we lived a privileged life, and it may have sounded like I was describing my life with servants, but in fact, for me as a child, I felt like they were very much part of my family. On the left is Tom with the dog Whiskey, and Tom was with us for 45 years. Ellen, the maid, one of the countless stories of suffering during the Civil War, Ellen went back to see her family in Enkeldoorn, her home village, and was murdered in front of her whole family. It was so traumatic. We wanted her not to go, but she wanted to see her family. And it was just one of countless stories that happened in those days. My mom is on the left here, getting ready to play lawn bowls, which most of the Jewish community played in a Jewish club called Wingate, although my mom didn't join that club, but this was some pictures from my house. and a family vacation. What you're seeing here is an actual photo from our family album going on vacation to Durban. We didn't fly because we wanted the car in Durban, and that meant that we'd have to have this land journey in the middle of a civil war and the very real possibility that we could be in real danger. We all traveled in an army convoy. If you wanted to stop, go to the bathroom, you put your hand on the hooter and you honked, and everyone had to stop. And I want to share a quick story of how real danger lived with us while I was growing up. My dad used to come home from work every day at the same time, 5:30. My mom would have his whiskey and his snack ready for him. And we would sit in the lounge and before the bell rang, and Tom would call us for dinner. One evening at 5:30, my dad wasn't home. And my dad didn't come home. It was 5:45 before I started to feel the atmosphere changing, and my mom started frowning. And an hour went by before phone calls were made. There was no one at the store. There was no hospital calls were made. I remember taking my little plastic red chair to the front of the driveway, just waiting and waiting. And he eventually came home late into the night. He had a flat tire. Of course, no one would stop. No one would dare to stop to help in those days. And I never, ever recovered from the fear of that day, but it was a sign of the times. So strange, and yet this picture here, strange and alien as this looks, day-to-day lives continued on. American culture came to us as it did in every other part in the world. This was the opening of Star Wars. It was sold out, the Rhodesian Armored Car Regiment. And in 1977, it happened in Rhodesia, just like it did in suburban North America, right in the middle of our Civil War. Zimbabwe from Civil War to today. So in the 1970s, the Civil War raged. 1980, Robert Mugabe became state president. Late 1990s, severe economic deterioration. A fire destroys the Bulawayo Synagogue in 2003, and only 350 Jews were in the country by this point. I'm going to read this slide because, as I mentioned, the end of our way of life was already clear to many of us. However, here's a little glimpse of how the Rhodesians felt, the Jewish community. The Jews of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, have gained new hope from the recent ceasefire ending the second 7-year civil war in that country. They perceive a return to normalcy, and some Jews are very optimistic about the future. Hatchwell, president of the Central African Zionist Organization, was quoted as saying in a recent issue of the Zionist Record, "We hope the ceasefire will adhere to and that we will see an end to this terrible slaughter. In the meantime, things are continuing as normal," Hatchwell said. "Communal life and organizations are still in full swing, and our enthusiasm has not been dampened in this respect. Nobody is panicked at the moment or looking to run away. We are carrying on as we used to." According to the Zionist Record, there are some 2,000 Jews in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, down from 7,000 in 1968. Since then, Jews emigrated along with in large part of the general white population because of the fighting and uncertain political future of the Central African nation. Nevertheless, there has been significant expansion in communal institutions and facilities in Jewish community, despite considerable turnover in congregational officials, the newspaper reported. It also noted that the Rhodesian Jewish community, always an affluent one, has been able to cope with internal difficulties without having to cut back on communal facilities or local needs or its support for Israel, the newspaper reported, which is amazing, amazing. So it wouldn't be a complete picture if we didn't touch on two of the biggest carriers of culture, language and food. My own journey has taken me from Zimbabwe to university in South Africa, to Israel, and now in Toronto. And in my work as a fundraiser at UJA, I've dealt almost exclusively with philanthropists and community members who are passionately committed to the preservation of Yiddish. But growing up in Zimbabwe, Ladino was very much alive. And I remember fat Ladino in our household. It just, for some reason, didn't seem to have passed down to the generation of my brother and I. Our parents spoke it when they didn't want us to hear or understand what we were talking about. I am really glad to see from this slide that there is a resurgence of Ladino with World Ladino Day taking place every February 21st. Food at home, this is my mom preparing for Jewish holidays. Food at home was directly inspired by Rhodes Island traditions, and the Ottoman Turkish influence was very apparent. This picture is my mom passing down the traditions. It's taken a couple of months ago in Australia, and she's teaching my niece, her grandchild, burakitas and borekas in Australia. And so here are some of the delicacies in our cuisine. Burakitas on the left, these are my pictures. I made these dishes, and I in turn am teaching my daughter how to make them. On the right is pastelikos. They're little pies with meat and rice. Very difficult to make the little pastries, but you make the shell and you fill it with a delicious filling and bake them. Here are some keftikas, which are meatballs, but they're special. They're very small. They're filled with delicious delicacies. This is a green vegetable. It's kale or any kind of Swiss chard, and it's baked with feta cheese, and sometimes people put potatoes in. Yaprakis, some people call them dalmadas, and they vine leaves, sometimes only rice and spices, sometimes with meat. And these are my stuffed peppers, which I made just last week, and a real delicacy and a staple of the Sephardic cuisine. Some desserts. On the left are patikas, which are beautiful thin pastry that you put into boiling hot oil just for a few seconds on each side. They puff up. They're so soft, crispy actually, but they melt in your mouth. And then you just drizzle honey or syrup and some sesame seeds and almonds on top. And rashikas are quite well-known biscuits that the Sephardics made. Here's our famous chiffon cake. This I also made very recently, and it's my mom's recipe, but it was a staple in the Sephardic cuisine. And if you're ever interested, I wanted to mention Stella Cohen has this beautiful book. She is a Benata and she is a cousin, but I highly recommend it if you're interested in delving into more Sephardic cuisine. She's a world-renowned expert on the cuisine and the history, and it's really a beautiful book. So in closing, I click a quick glimpse of the present-day population. There are fewer than 100 Jews, most of them elderly. The white population is 1/10 of what it was at its peak, and the indigenous Black population into its 5th decade of self-rule, as it should be. This is a picture of the beautiful Sephardic shul, and it's last year. Here is some masks on. There's still minyans that take place. It's a beautiful synagogue, and they continue with the traditions, and they continue with having services. And something I just saw this morning on Facebook, and I just wanted to add this in. This past Thursday, the newly appointed non-resident ambassador of the State of Israel to Zimbabwe, Ofra Fari, and the traveling rabbi, this is a traveling rabbi that travels through Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, and the president of Zimbabwe, His Excellency Mnangagwa, at the State House in Harare. And it seemed like they had a very positive exchange. This is the caption. The traveling rabbi who represents the African Jewish Congress and the Jewish communities in Zimbabwe thanked the president for allowing the Jewish communities to practice their religion without any hindrance in his country. The president remarked that Jews are always welcome in his country and recalled with fondness the many Jewish individuals who made great contributions to Zimbabwe and previously Southern Rhodesia in various areas from medicine, commerce, etc. The rabbi then presented the president with a Kiddush cup and elaborated on the importance of Kiddush and what wine plays in the Jewish religion, and blessed and encouraged the president to undertake his role with a great level of sanctity. So I'm about to play something for you, and I'd like you to bear in mind that the year is 2018. It's 3 years ago, and there are no Jews in the school. This is my school, my Jewish day school. This is the Carmel Jewish Primary School in Bulawayo, but our sister school from Harare, and there are no Jews. And please enjoy this. It's just amazing that there's just no Jews left in the school, and they still sing and learn Hebrew and have Purim. It's just wonderful that the Jewish traditions and customs have continued. So just before I say goodbye, I want to open it up if any questions have come in. And if you have any questions, I wanted to say thank you in a very Sephardic manner. This is a beautiful Ladino blessing. In Ladino, it was customary to thank the cook after enjoying a meal with this blessing. I say it to you all now, who took the time to share this time together. Bendichas manos. It is a blessing that was meant to extend beyond the kitchen to all of life. Thank you.
Janice, that was such a touching ending to your presentation. To see those little kids singing Hatikva, and none of them are Jewish.
None of them.
Thank you. Thank you for such a lovely presentation. Quite frankly, I never really knew there were Jews in Zimbabwe.
I know.
I met you. I hope that all of you who've been watching and listening have put your questions into the chat on YouTube. And please send those questions to us, because I will pose those questions to Janice, and she will be very happy to answer those questions. Okay, so please take a few minutes to put your questions in. In the meantime, here's the first question. Who funds the Carmel School today?
Wow. You know what? I don't even know. What I think, it's definitely a private school. So whether it became government funded over the last number of years, I'm not sure. But the Sharon School in Harare and Carmel in Bulawayo operate in the same way. Private school. They probably realize that the education is very high. So maybe there's diplomats that are their parents. I mean, there's all walks of life that live in Zimbabwe now. So I imagine it's school fees, because it was always privately funded. And it's just amazing that they still continue. They all speak Hebrew, all those little kids. It's amazing.
Oh, wow. So did you have any Hebrew teachers there then, if they all speak Hebrew?
We had always had Hebrew teachers all my growing up, and they still do to this day. And I hear, because I'm part of a Zimbabwean Jewish Facebook group, where we're all from all over the diaspora. There's quite a number of us on the group, and I read the comments, and I see that, the school still operates. It's amazing.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Here's another question that's come up. Do you see any parallels between minority rule over the indigenous Black population in Rhodesia and the situation with Palestinians in Israel?
Wow. Probably. I mean, I hesitate to get too political here, but there probably are some parallels. There was a lot of tribal conflict in Zimbabwe, which is not the same as the Palestinian conflict today. We had a white-black problem, so to speak, and there was a lot of conflict between the whites and the blacks. But in addition to that, within the Black and indigenous populations, they had their own tribal issues. And I mean, I probably crosses over into so many other areas in the world that have the same problems. But I remember distinctly there's the Mashona tribe and the Matabele and the Zulus, and they didn't get along with each other. So it was very rife with conflict, even if it wasn't just for the blacks and the whites.
Okay. Do I understand correctly? You don't know what drew your family to Rhodesia? I'll finish the question. Did the UK perhaps offer incentives for Jews to move there?
The UK, you mean England?
The United Kingdom? Yeah, did England offer any incentives for them to go?
I mean, Rhodesia was a British protectorate, and I really don't know the answer to that. I would imagine, like many Jews from around the world, and my families were looking for a better life. I mean, there was probably hardships going on in Rhodes Island. I know in the 30s for sure there were, as the war was coming up, and I don't know what was going on in the 20s, but I believe that many of them came down looking for prosperity, a new place to start. One hears from the other, and I don't know about the influence of England, though. I really don't. It's interesting. I'm going to look that up.
Yeah. Okay. Based on what you presented, Zimbabwe's connection with the Jewish community, their connection to the Jewish community generally, and to Israel in particular, what is it like today? Do you have any idea?
I mean, again, I haven't been there for a long, long time. I do want to make a comment, though. Growing up in Zimbabwe, Israel was strong in our lives, but not as strong as it is between Toronto, Canada, and Israel. We were more Jewish than connected to Israel. It was kind of a foreign thing to say. When I told my parents I was going to go and live in Israel, it was like, what? Like, it was a big shock. I think that there's a connection. I see now from what happened this week, there's an ambassador that went there. So it feels like there's no real problems. And I don't think they ever were. I just don't know that it was as strong a connection as it is here between the Canadian Jews and Israel, which is an extremely strong tie.
Okay. Can you elaborate on specific differences in customs and traditions that you had in Zimbabwe, as compared to what we do here?
Sure. Actually, just last week, I was sitting in my colleague's office, and she was taking out her lunch, which was 2 hard-boiled eggs, and she's Ashkenazi, and she took the egg and was about to bite right into this egg, and I don't do that. And she goes, why not? And I said, well, the Sephardic Jews only bite into a whole egg right after a funeral. When you go home after the funeral, you sit in a round circle, and that is a symbolism of life to continue on. And so it's a total different culture between the Sephardics and the Ashkenazis. And there's some other cultural things, like we eat rice, and Ashkenazis don't eat rice. And I know that probably causes some conflict in families on Passover, because they don't know what they can and can't. But there probably are quite a few significant differences between the foods in the 2 different countries.
Oh, okay. I found it very interesting because a lot of the foods that you showed were foods that my Iraqi grandmother
Oh,
used to
wow.
prepare, okay, in India. So
Yeah.
I grew up eating a lot of those foods. Now the flavors might be different because of whatever spices were available in their respective countries, but a lot of it was very similar. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is like
Wow.
living it all over again,
That's
and
great.
it was great, yeah, to watch that. Um, how connected is the Zimbabwe community since you've left, Zimbabwe and you've dispersed all over the world? How connected is the community as a whole today, even though you're dispersed? Is there any connection between
You
you
know,
all?
there definitely is. There's a few ways, as I mentioned, we have a Facebook group, and there's a few thousand members. That's a Zimbabwean Jewish Facebook group. There's some in Toronto,
Mhm.
and we try. I mean, we're all over the world, like completely all over the world. Lots in Australia and England, South Africa, Israel, and I'm in touch with some across the world. I think we have this bond. We come from a
Mhm.
small place. We all knew each other.
Yeah.
If we went to the same day school, we hear about each other's news. I mean, I wish we were even closer in touch. Just
Mhm.
last week, I just heard about a school friend that's here and is a doctor in Toronto. And I was at school with him, and I didn't realize that, he lived in Toronto.
You
So
lived it.
like we do, I think there is a bond, and we do try to stay in touch.
Where did the Zimbabwe Jews emigrate to? Where? Oh, you just mentioned a whole lot.
Yes, but
Was
almost excuse it went England because we were allowed
England?
to go. I mean, on the
Yeah.
Zimbabwean passport, you didn't have that many options. Israel,
Mm-hmm.
South Africa, Australia, and Canada. Some went to the
In
States. I'm
Canada.
sure there was immigration to the States. I think Australia,
Yeah,
the weather was a little bit closer. We had
close.
perfect weather in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Canada scared a lot of the Zimbabweans with the weather, but there's a lot of
It's
Southern Africans
okay.
here.
Oh, okay. How did the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities in Zimbabwe relate to each other?
Um, there was a bit of rivalry. There was some, I think the Sephardics thought they were the aristocratic Jews, and the Ashkenazis thought they were better educated and more literate. But we got along and we did a lot of things together. There were some communal Jewish simchas and youth movements and JNF and WITSO, but there was definitely some rivalry between the communities. The Ashkenazis were larger in numbers, quite significantly more came. Most of them Lithuania, Poland, the Eastern Europeans, and most of the Rhodesians came from Rhodes Island. There were other Sephardic
Okay.
places, here in
Yeah.
Toronto, I know there's Sephardics from North Africa. Most of the
Mhm.
Rhodesian Sephardics were from Rhodes.
Okay. These days, are there more Sephardic Jews in South Africa than in Zimbabwe? And if so, are more of them in Cape Town than in Johannesburg?
I'm sure there are more in South Africa than Zimbabwe because there's hardly any left. Like really, the only ones that are left are really older, and there's a few, less than 100 in the whole country. But I don't know whether they would have gone to Cape Town versus Joburg. I imagine, just like Jews do all over the world, they're going to end up where their family members are. So wherever their family are, I know we have some cousins in Cape Town and in Johannesburg. So I imagine it's probably pretty split, but mostly in those two cities.
There's two cities. Okay. Well, those are all the questions that we've received to so far. So I'll continue. Janice, on behalf of Alan and myself and Congregation BINA and all of our supporting organizations and all those on the webinar this evening, I wish to say thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us this evening. I, for one, as I mentioned to you before, had no knowledge of the Jewish community in Zimbabwe. Listening to you has been a great learning experience. You have educated us about the history, the culture, and traditions of Jews in Zimbabwe. Having personally lived during turmoil and unrest in India, I empathize with what you and your family and the Jewish community experienced in Zimbabwe. It is good that you all were able to leave and settle elsewhere. I'm glad you finally chose to come to Canada, and especially Toronto. The Toronto Jewish community has definitely benefited from all your work at UJA.
Thank you.
Thank you for all that you do through UJA, and you do it for us all.
That's so nice. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you.
Folks, I have some good news to share. When we last heard from Rivka Campbell on the Jews of Jamaica, many of you told us that there is much more for us to still learn about Jewish life in Jamaica for the past 350 years at least. I heard from so many of you following the presentation, and you all asked for a speaker that was born and grew up in Jamaica to speak on that subject. So we are fortunate to have Ainsley Cohen Enrique, a born Jewish Jamaican, still living there, to be our speaker on Sunday, July the 10th at 7 p.m. Ainsley, who has been very active in the Jamaican Jewish community for many years, will speak on the Jewish Jamaican story since 1656. He assures us that we will all learn many more interesting stories from his presentation. I hope you will all join us again on July 10th. Until then, thank you and good night.